The heat of the city pressed down as Marcus Owens, a black street vendor, faced down the police, harassed, humiliated, pushed to the edge. But just as things were about to explode, a shadow loomed over the officers. It was Brock Lesnar. "You will not intimidate these people," he growled, stepping in to fight for justice. The battle for dignity was about to begin. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the city streets. The air was thick with the smell of hot asphalt and exhaust fumes. As the world moved with a relentless pulse, Marcus Owens stood at his street cart, a small oasis of vibrant color amid the drab concrete jungle. His stall, tucked in the corner of a bustling intersection, was filled with handcrafted jewelry, art, and little trinkets that told stories of his community, stories of resilience, of dreams made real through sweat and perseverance. For years, Marcus had worked this corner, his hands worn from shaping each piece with care, his heart beating with the quiet rhythm of survival. Every day was a struggle, but it was his struggle. The world passed him by, but his art spoke louder than the noise of the city. He didn't have much, but what he did have, he valued deeply. But today, something felt off. There was an unease in the air, a tension Marcus couldn't shake. He couldn't place it. Maybe it was the way people walked past him, their eyes averting his gaze, or the constant hum of the city that seemed to grow louder as if something was about to break. Then, without warning, the screech of tires cut through the air, followed by the rumble of a police car rolling up to the curb. Marcus's heart skipped a beat. He'd been through this before, knew what was coming. But each time it happened, it felt like a gut punch. The car stopped, and the officers, 4 of them, climbed out in perfect synchronicity. Their uniforms were crisp, their faces unreadable, but the way they looked at him was all too familiar. It was the same look he'd seen time and time again, the look that said, "You don't belong here." "Move it along," one of the officers barked, his voice carrying across the street like a whip crack. "You're blocking the sidewalk." Marcus stood tall, his muscles tightening in response. He had seen it all before: the daily humiliation, the unprovoked aggression. He'd learned to swallow his anger, to keep his head down and comply. It wasn't worth the fight. "I'm just trying to make a living," man Marcus said, his voice steady but edged with a frustration he could no longer hide. "Living?" the officer sneered, taking a step forward. "You're illegally occupying public space, causing a disturbance. Pack it up." The word stung like a slap, but Marcus wasn't surprised. He was used to the condescension, the way his very presence was treated like an inconvenience. He bent down, quickly gathering his things, his hands moving with practiced efficiency, but his heart thudded in his chest. He knew this wasn't just about his cart. It never was. It was about power, about control, about making sure he and everyone like him knew their place. As Marcus continued to gather his wares, the officers closed in, the distance between them narrowing like a tightening noose. He could feel their eyes on him, cold, judgmental. He was nothing to them. But then, a voice, deep, commanding, and unwavering, cut through the tension. "What's going on here?" Marcus froze, his hands mid-motion. The officers stilled too, momentarily distracted by the interruption. And that was when he saw him. A tall, broad figure stepped into the scene, his shadow falling over Marcus's cart like a protective wall. Brock Lesnar. The name alone carried weight like a thunderstorm gathering on the horizon. The WWE champion, the man whose presence had the power to shift the very air around him. Marcus had heard of him, of course. Who hadn't? But seeing him in person, standing right here, in this moment, it was surreal. Brock's eyes flicked to the officers, sizing them up, the kind of stare that made grown men pause. His jaw was set, his expression unreadable, but there was a raw intensity in the way he carried himself, an unspoken promise that he wasn't backing down from anyone, no matter who they were. "What's going on here?" Brock repeated, his voice deep and gravelly, his tone not a question, but an order. The officers seemed taken aback for a moment, their authority wavering under Brock's imposing presence. One of them shifted uncomfortably, but none of them dared to speak for a few long, awkward seconds. "I said," Brock's voice dropped even lower, his words an undeniable command now. "What's going on here?" Marcus glanced up at Brock, feeling something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time: hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, there was someone who cared, someone who would stand by him. The officer who had been speaking to him sputtered, his eyes darting between Marcus and Brock. "This man's causing a disturbance. We're asking him to move along." Brock didn't look away from the officers. "I don't think he's causing a disturbance," Brock said, his voice rumbling with a quiet authority that made the officers flinch. "But you're sure as hell causing one." Marcus's pulse raced, the realization dawning on him Brock Lesnar wasn't just passing by. He was here in this moment, standing up for him. For the first time in as long as Marcus could remember, he wasn't alone. But as the tension between Brock and the officers simmered, Marcus knew this wasn't over. It had only just begun. The city was a patchwork of ambition and apathy. For some, it was a place of opportunity, a land of dreams where anyone could carve out their future. For others, it was a maze of cracked sidewalks and broken promises, where every turn seemed to offer another obstacle to overcome. Marcus Owens was no stranger to this. Born and raised in a neighborhood where hope was a rare commodity, he had learned from an early age how to fight for what was his. Raised by his grandmother after his parents were lost to the streets, Marcus had seen enough pain and loss to last a lifetime. But she had taught him one thing that would stick with him forever: you work for what you want. No one gives you anything. Her words rang in his ears as he crafted his jewelry and art, each piece a labor of love, a representation of his culture, his struggle, and his resilience. For Marcus, his street cart wasn't just a way to make a living, it was a testament to his survival, his defiance against a system that had too often tried to push him down. He'd set up his cart in the same spot every day, beneath the shadow of the skyscrapers, where the rush of the city seemed to forget about the people who didn't fit the mold. His small stall was an oasis of color amid the gray world that surrounded him. Customers came and went, some stopping out of curiosity, others out of genuine interest in his work. But Marcus knew the reality. Every sale, every interaction, was a small victory against the indifference of the world. It wasn't just the passers-by who didn't understand Marcus's life. The police had always been a looming presence, a constant reminder that no matter how hard he worked, no matter how much he tried to carve out a place for himself, there were forces in the world that would always see him as an inconvenience. Every day they circled his cart, eyes narrow, waiting for an excuse to make him pack up and move along. It wasn't about the law, it was about control, about reminding him that he wasn't welcome. It had happened before, countless times, but he had learned to keep his head down, to endure. He had to. He had no other choice. But today it felt different. Today the air was thick with a tension that Marcus couldn't shake. His palms were sweaty as he adjusted a necklace in his cart, the small beads cool to the touch. As the sound of tires screeching grew louder, he knew something was about to go wrong. On the surface, Brock Lesnar and Marcus Owens couldn't have been more different. Brock was a towering figure, built like a freight train, with a reputation that preceded him. In the ring, he was known for his raw power, his ruthlessness, and his ability to dominate anyone who stood in his path. His career had skyrocketed from a small-town farm boy in Minnesota to one of the biggest names in the WWE, his every move watched by millions of fans around the world. But despite the bright lights and the roaring crowds, there was a part of Brock that felt hollow. Brock had always been driven by the need to prove himself. Whether it was in the wrestling ring, on the football field, or in his personal life, he had constantly sought validation. The money, the fame, the accolades, they were all supposed to mean something, right? But lately, they didn't. There was a gnawing emptiness that had started to creep into his life. Fame had come at a cost. Behind the persona of the beast who crushed opponents with ease, there was a man who longed for purpose, something that went beyond his scripted battles in the ring. He had left WWE on multiple occasions, seeking solace in other avenues. Brock dabbled in mixed martial arts, took some time off to farm and hunt on his family's land, and even tried his hand at acting. But nothing seemed to fill the void. It was only when he began to step away from the glare of the spotlight that he started noticing the world around him in a way he hadn't before. He saw the poverty, the disparity between those who had and those who had nothing. He had come to realize that his journey, his drive for dominance, had been a selfish one that focused on what he could take, not what he could give. One morning, while walking through the streets of the city, Brock found himself standing on a street corner, watching a young man at a cart, much like Marcus's. Brock's steps slowed as he observed the exchange between the vendor and a couple of officers who had approached. The officers' tone was harsh, their body language menacing. It was nothing new to Brock, he had seen this kind of interaction before. The undercurrent of racism, the imbalance of power, the way some people were treated like they didn't belong. Brock wasn't a stranger to conflict. He had spent years fighting against the world in one form or another. But in that moment, something in him snapped. He knew what it was like to be underestimated, to be seen as a threat simply because of how he looked or who he was. But the difference between him and others was that he had the power to change things, to confront injustice head-on. He had never thought of himself as a hero, but in that moment the realization hit him he couldn't stand idly by and watch this man suffer. Not again, not when he had the ability to help. His whole life had been spent in battle, in struggle. But this wasn't a battle for fame or for money or for glory. This was something real, something that mattered. Brock didn't know Marcus. But the injustice he saw, the way the officers dismissed the young man's existence, was something he couldn't ignore. His instincts kicked in the same instincts that had made him an unstoppable force in the ring. Meanwhile, Marcus had reached the point where he was no longer just trying to make a living. He was fighting for dignity, for recognition. Every time the officers came by, it wasn't just a physical battle to pack up his cart. It was a reminder of everything he'd been forced to endure. He wasn't just a vendor, he was a black man trying to survive in a world that didn't always let him. And every time the police made him feel small, it chipped away at his resolve, his belief in fairness. That was why today, when the officers appeared once again, Marcus's blood began to boil. He could feel the sting of their words before they even spoke, the dismissiveness in their eyes. But before he could react, he saw something that made him stop cold. Brock Lesnar. He stood there, tall and unwavering, a giant amidst the chaos. Marcus didn't know why he had stepped in, but in that moment he realized something important. There were people out there who were willing to fight, who were willing to challenge the powers that be. For the first time in a long while, Marcus felt like he wasn't alone in his fight. But as Brock and the officers exchanged tense words, Marcus knew this moment wasn't the end, it was just the beginning. The officers didn't back down easily, and Brock's presence wasn't enough to change the system that had been in place for years. This was a city built on inequality, a world where power was wielded by those who didn't always have the best interests of the people in mind. What had started as a small confrontation was about to escalate into something far bigger, a battle that would test both Brock and Marcus in ways they never anticipated. For Marcus, this moment was about more than just his street card. It was about his right to exist without fear, to live without being harassed. And for Brock, it was the beginning of his own journey to find purpose beyond the wrestling ring. The morning after the confrontation with the police, Marcus was back at his cart, hands trembling as he arranged the remnants of his merchandise. His stall had been left in disarray the day before, artwork scattered, jewelry broken, and his spirit bruised. But today, something inside him had shifted. He couldn't just let this go. For the first time, he wasn't just going to take the blows and move on. He was going to fight back. The word about what happened spread quickly. Viral footage was shared across social media, showing the officers harassing Marcus and the looming figure of Brock Lesnar standing between him and the police, a giant of a man who had demanded answers. The videos sparked outrage, especially within Marcus's community, but the larger world outside the neighborhood was watching too. People saw the confrontation as a battle of David versus Goliath, an underdog story that resonated with anyone who had ever felt marginalized or oppressed. The buzz was enough to make the local news, and even national outlets picked up the story. But while the videos were a symbol of resistance, the world wasn't ready to let Marcus win just yet. The system was still in place, and those in power weren't about to let some street vendor and a famous wrestler dictate the rules. Marcus, however, was determined. He filed a formal complaint against the officers involved, demanding accountability from the city. It was a long shot, but it was a shot that had to be taken. He walked into the City Hall building with his head held high, his heart racing with a mix of fear and defiance. He wasn't naive enough to think that the city would roll over and apologize. But his dignity, his very sense of self, was at stake. I want the officer's badge number. I want their names. I want to know why I was treated like a criminal when I was doing nothing but trying to make a living, Marcus demanded, his voice steady despite the anger that simmered beneath it. He had never felt more out of place in this sterile office building, but he wasn't backing down. The woman behind the counter gave him a polite smile, but it was clear she had heard his kind of complaint 1,000 times before. She nodded, taking down his information. "We'll get back to you," she said. though it didn't feel like a promise so much as a way of pushing him out the door. Marcus left feeling like a gnat buzzing in the ear of a giant. But it didn't stop him. It couldn't. His resolve was stronger than it had been before. But that very night, as he was working on his next batch of jewelry in his small, sparsely furnished apartment, the retaliation began. It was too late for anyone to be out causing trouble, Marcus thought, as he closed his door and locked the deadbolt behind him. He had just finished polishing a necklace when he heard the sound of glass shattering. His head snapped up and his heart lurched. The sound was unmistakable. The front door had been kicked in. He bolted out of his chair, but before he could move toward the hallway, a shadow appeared in the corner of his vision. The door was wide open, and the wreckage was immediate. His entire inventory of designs, customer lists, and business contacts had been shredded. His personal belongings were thrown about in the chaos. His apartment, which had once felt like a haven, now looked like a war zone. He rushed toward his desk, but it was too late. All his work was gone, his art, his records, everything he had fought so hard to build. Whoever did this wasn't just after his business, they were sending a message. They wanted him silenced. And they knew exactly how to hurt him. He stood frozen in the wreckage for a moment, the weight of it crashing over him. But as the initial shock began to wear off, a cold fire ignited inside him. This wasn't just about his business, it was about his life. They wanted him to disappear, to stop fighting back, to go back to the corner and accept his place. But Marcus wasn't going to let that happen. The anger burned like a raw nerve, but there was something else beneath it, a deep sense of betrayal. Who could do this? Who had the power to send a message like this and think they could just get away with it? Meanwhile, as Brock sat at his home in Minnesota, the news of the attack on Marcus reached him through his phone. The viral video, the police confrontation, and now this a brutal act of retaliation that Marcus didn't deserve. The rage Brock had felt when he witnessed Marcus being harassed by the officers flared back up. But this time, it was different. It was personal. Brock had never been one to sit back and let injustice slide. He wasn't just going to watch from the sidelines. He was a fighter, always had been. But he wasn't fighting for a belt, or a paycheck, or even for glory. This time, he was fighting for something far more important: justice. His first step was simple. He called Marcus. "Marcus, I heard about what happened." Brock's voice was low, serious. "I'm coming down there. We're going to fix this." For the first time, Marcus heard something in Brock's voice that was more than just sympathy. There was determination there, a shared sense of purpose. Brock didn't see him as just a street vendor, some random person he could help out of a moment of kindness. No, Brock saw him as someone fighting the same fight. "I don't know how you'll help, Brock. It's not just about me. It's about a whole system that's broken," Marcus said, his voice tight with frustration. "We're going to take it one step at a time. We'll find who's behind this, and we'll make them answer for what they did to you," Brock replied, a promise in his tone. Brock's plan was simple. They would start gathering evidence. They would reach out to lawyers who had experience with police brutality cases. They would dig into the past of the officers involved and find out who was pulling the strings. There were ways to fight back, but it wouldn't be easy. Marcus didn't know if he had the energy for another battle, but Brock's resolve was infectious. The deeper they dug, the more they realized they were up against something bigger. The officers involved weren't acting alone. As Brock and Marcus began to piece together the evidence, they discovered that the corruption ran deeper than they had ever imagined. There were whispers, rumors about illegal activities within the police department, and about a larger network of power players, city officials, business owners, and politicians who had been colluding to maintain the status quo. As Marcus looked through documents and evidence with Brock, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. The officers had been taking bribes, pushing people off streets, harassing vendors, and even turning a blind eye to worse crimes, all while pretending to uphold the law. The system wasn't just broken, it was rotting from the inside out. And the deeper they went, the more dangerous it became. The more they threatened to expose the truth, the more the forces behind the scenes began to push back. But Marcus and Brock were no longer just fighting for survival. They were fighting for justice for every person who had been silenced before them. The days following their decision to take on the system were some of the hardest Marcus and Brock had ever faced. What had begun as an act of solidarity between two unlikely allies had quickly spiraled into something far more dangerous. They were no longer just fighting the police officers who had harassed Marcus, they were fighting an entire system of corruption that had been festering for years. What they were up against was far more insidious than they had ever imagined. Marcus and Brock knew they couldn't do this alone. The first step was to recruit allies who knew the lay of the land: community activists, former police officers who had turned whistleblower, and an experienced lawyer who had a reputation for taking on cases of police brutality. It wasn't long before the word began to spread about their investigation. People in the community, who had suffered under the heavy hand of corrupt law enforcement, were ready to speak out. Marcus and Brock sat down with Lena, a local journalist who had been following the abuse of power in their city for years. Her deep knowledge of the situation and her extensive network of contacts proved invaluable. She gave them insight into the long-standing pattern of abuse, particularly targeting black street vendors and small businesses in the area. The officers involved in Marcus's altercation weren't just rogue cops, they were part of a larger scheme to seize control of the local vending market, using intimidation and threats to force vendors to pay for protection. Marcus, Lena said, leaning over the table in their cramped meeting room, "This is bigger than just your case. These officers have been extorting businesses for months. You're not the first to file a complaint, but you're the first one with enough guts to actually do something about it." The realization hit Marcus hard. His own experience had been part of a much larger problem, and he had just unknowingly scratched the surface. This wasn't just about a handful of corrupt officers. It was a full-blown criminal operation. As the investigation deepened, the layers of corruption began to unravel. Marcus and Brock discovered that the officers involved in the initial altercation were part of an underground network of police officers and local politicians working together to control and extort vulnerable groups. The vendors were systematically targeted, threatened with fines, arrests, or worse. Unless they paid for protection, it was a racket that had been in place for years, and the police force wasn't just turning a blind eye, it was an active participant. But the deeper they dug, the more dangerous their situation became. Every time they uncovered a new lead, the retaliation grew stronger. Threats started arriving: anonymous phone calls, strange cars lingering outside Marcus's apartment. The unease they had both felt from the beginning now felt like a suffocating weight on their shoulders. Brock, a man who had spent his entire life in the spotlight, was used to threats. But this was different. The people behind this network weren't the type to throw punches in the ring. They played dirty. They played for keeps. "You need to be careful," Marcus Brock said one evening as they sat in his EV, parked down the street from Marcus's apartment. He had been doing some reconnaissance, observing the shady figures who seemed to always appear whenever they got too close to the truth. These people don't just disappear. If we keep pushing them, it's not just you and me they'll come after. Marcus, however, was resolute. He had come too far to turn back. "They've been bullying me for years, Brock. I've spent my whole life keeping my head down, just trying to survive. But now, I'm not going anywhere. They want to fight? Let's give them one." Brock admired Marcus's tenacity, but he also feared for his safety. The fight was no longer just about exposing corrupt officers, it had become a battle for survival. The system wasn't just fighting back. It was lashing out, determined to protect itself at all costs. One night, as Brock was leaving Marcus's apartment after another long meeting, he found a threatening note on the windshield of his truck. It was simple, direct, and chilling: "Leave this alone, or it's not just Marcus you'll be saving." The message was clear. They were now in the crosshairs. Brock knew that with his fame came a certain level of protection, but it also made him a target. He wasn't just a wrestler anymore. He was the face of a resistance movement, the symbol of a fight for justice that the corrupt powers in the city had no intention of losing. When Brock showed the note to Marcus, his first instinct was to call the police, but they both knew that the very people they were up against had connections within the force. Calling them would only expose their next move. Instead, they did what they had always done: they kept pushing forward. With every step closer to the truth, things got more dangerous. The harassment became more direct. One evening, as Marcus was packing up his cart after a long day, a group of men, wearing dark clothing, approached him. They weren't the usual officers who had harassed him before. These men were different. They weren't concerned with just moving his cart along. They were there to send a message. "Hey you," one of the men barked. "We know what you're up to. We've been watching you and your big friend. You think you're going to bring us down with all your talking? You've got another thing coming." Marcus stood his ground, though his heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't sure whether these men were police officers, hired muscle, or something worse. But he wasn't about to back down. "What are you talking about?" Marcus demanded, trying to keep his voice steady. "Keep your mouth shut, and this doesn't have to get ugly. You really want to keep poking the bear, Marcus? You and your big buddy," the man smirked, leaning in closer. "This could end real quick for you." Marcus's fists clenched. This wasn't the first time he'd been threatened, but this felt different. These men weren't interested in just taking his business away. They were trying to break him. But before things could escalate further, Brock appeared. His towering figure stepped between Marcus and the men. He wasn't wearing his usual wrestling gear, but his presence alone was enough to make the men hesitate. "You need to leave." Now Brock growled, his voice a low rumble of authority. The men backed off, but the threat was clear. They weren't afraid of Brock's physical presence, they were afraid of what he represented. And they would stop at nothing to silence him. As they regrouped, Marcus and Brock made an important discovery. The corruption they had uncovered was more than just about money or control over the street vendors. The scheme had grown into something much darker. A deep dive into public records, anonymous tips from former law enforcement officers, and a network of underground sources revealed a connection between the corrupt officers and powerful figures in the city's real estate and construction industries. They had been using their power to push out black-owned businesses, forcing them into deals that would allow their properties to be sold off to developers at a fraction of their value. It was a land grab, a way to gentrify the area at the expense of the people who had built their lives there. The discovery hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just about police brutality. It was about erasing his community, his home. These men were not just trying to intimidate him, they were trying to erase everything he had worked for. The fight had become about much more than survival. It was about reclaiming his life, his dignity, and his place in the world. With the stakes higher than ever, Marcus and Brock knew there was no turning back. They had already exposed a network of corruption that reached deep into the city's core. The enemies they had made were powerful and dangerous, but now it was personal. What had begun as a fight for justice for a single man had become a fight for the future of an entire community. Brock's role had shifted. No longer just the outsider offering help, he had become a vital part of the resistance. His status and fame, once seen as a weapon to intimidate, had become a rallying cry. People were listening. They were watching. And now it was time for them to act. The day of the protest had finally arrived. It was an overcast morning, the sky a heavy gray, mirroring the tension that hung in the air. Marcus stood at the front of a growing crowd on the courthouse steps, feeling the weight of his decision pressing down on him. His heart hammered in his chest, his palms damp with sweat. This wasn't just another protest, this was the culmination of everything he'd fought for: his dignity, his community, and his future. Beside him stood Brock, the massive presence that had, from the very beginning, been the shield between Marcus and those who sought to crush him. Brock's jaw was set in that familiar steely expression, unwavering, resolute. It was as if his entire career in the WWE had led him to this moment, not in the ring, but standing in the face of injustice, determined to fight back. The crowd was a mixture of concerned citizens, activists, journalists, and ordinary people who had seen the story unfold and refused to sit in silence any longer. They had come to hear Marcus speak out, to demand accountability from the corrupt police officers and the city officials who had let them operate unchecked. But just as Marcus took a deep breath, stepping forward to address the crowd, the sound of sirens echoed through the street, followed by the harsh screech of police cars pulling up to the courthouse steps. The air seemed to tighten, the low murmur of the crowd shifting to nervous whispers. The officers, clad in riot gear, stepped out of their vehicles, their eyes scanning the crowd, looking for any sign of trouble. Marcus felt a lump form in his throat. He'd known this was coming: the harassment, the threats, the intimidation, but now that it was here, the fear gripped him in a way it hadn't before. What if this was the end? What if they couldn't win? But before the officers could move any further, Brock stepped forward, his enormous body filling the space between the protesters and the law enforcement officers. He was a wall of muscle, but it wasn't just his size that commanded attention, it was the calm fury in his eyes, the unshakable confidence that had made him a legend in the wrestling world. The lead officer, a grizzled man with a scowl etched permanently on his face, took a few steps forward, his hand resting on the handle of his baton, ready to crack down on the crowd. He stopped when his eyes landed on Brock. "You need to disperse." Now the officer barked, his voice sharp and dismissive. He hadn't expected anyone to stand up to him, let alone someone like Brock Lesnar. His hand twitched near his weapon, a clear sign of his intent. Brock's voice rumbled through the air, low but commanding. "You will not intimidate these people." The officer hesitated. Brock wasn't just some athlete who could be pushed around. He wasn't in a wrestling ring, and this wasn't a scripted fight. This was real. And Brock knew that. He had spent years in the public eye, had seen and felt the weight of power in ways few ever could. But this was different. This wasn't about winning a match. This was about winning a fight that had been rigged for far too long. "Marcus has the right to be here," Brock continued, his voice cutting through the rising tension. "These people have the right to be heard. You're not going to stop them." The officer's gaze flickered from Brock to Marcus, his lips tightening into a thin line. He was clearly out of his element. This was no ordinary protest, and these weren't ordinary people standing against him. Behind Marcus, the crowd was watching in a tense silence, waiting for the moment of conflict to erupt. Marcus could feel their collective energy, an electric pulse of hope and fear. It was like nothing he had ever felt before. His legs felt weak, but there was no turning back now. The fight for justice was no longer just his. It was everyone's. The officer took a hesitant step back, clearly unsure of how to respond to Brock's unyielding presence. There was a flicker of doubt in his eyes, and for the first time in weeks, Marcus felt like he wasn't fighting alone. But just as it seemed like the situation might de-escalate, the tension shattered. A shout rang out from the crowd. Someone had thrown something, a bottle or a rock. The police officer's hand flew to his baton, and suddenly the air was alive with the crack of orders being barked out. Officers began to move, pushing forward, aiming to break up the crowd, and chaos descended upon the steps. Marcus's heart skipped a beat. This was it, the moment he had been dreading. The moment when the system would show its true face. But then Brock moved. He was a blur of motion, his massive form pushing past the officers, clearing a path between them and the protesters. He wasn't fighting back with violence. He didn't need to. It was his sheer force of will, the weight of his reputation, and the undeniable truth of what they were all standing for that made the officers stop dead in their tracks. One of the officers, younger than the rest, looked at Brock, his face conflicted. His hand hovered nervously near his taser, but he couldn't bring himself to draw it. Something had shifted. The officers were no longer just the enforcers of power, they were human beings, and Brock's words had made them see that. The crowd, sensing the shift, began to chant. At first it was a murmur, but then it grew louder, swelling into a unified call for justice. No justice, no peace. No justice, no peace. The chant echoed through the streets, a powerful sound that seemed to shake the very foundation of the city. The officer who had been leading the charge against Marcus and the protesters finally lowered his baton. The message was clear. The fight was no longer just about power, it was about the people, their voices, their rights. And for once, it seemed that the system was being forced to listen. As the police hesitated, Brock's calm authority continued to dominate the situation. He wasn't going to let the protesters be silenced. He wasn't going to let Marcus and the others be pushed aside any longer. And as the tension slowly dissipated, the local news cameras, already on the scene, captured everything. The moment when the world saw Brock Lesnar, not as a wrestler, but as a fighter for justice. What happened next was swift. The officer who had been leading the charge suddenly received a call in his earpiece. His face paled as he listened, and then he turned to his colleagues. The scene shifted again, this time, not in the protesters' favor, but not in the way anyone expected. The officers began to arrest their own. One by one, the officers who had been involved in the corruption began to be led away in handcuffs, their badges stripped from their chests. The investigation into the corruption was no longer a quiet affair, it had become public, and the truth was undeniable. For Marcus and Brock, it was a moment of triumph. The officers were arrested, but the fight was far from over. The system they had fought against was vast, and many still stood to protect it. But for the first time in weeks, Marcus allowed himself a brief moment of relief. The courthouse steps, which had been a battleground, were now filled with people celebrating a victory. It was a victory for Marcus, for the community, and for everyone who had fought to be heard. As Brock stood beside Marcus, his voice low but filled with satisfaction, he spoke one final time to the crowd. "This is just the beginning," he said. "We've shown them that we won't back down. We've shown them that the people have power, and we're not going anywhere." The crowd erupted into cheers. Brock's words, the power of his presence, and the collective strength of the community had turned the tide. This wasn't just about a single victory, it was the spark of something larger. Marcus looked at Brock, the man who had risked everything for him, for justice, and for the future of his community. He nodded in gratitude. The battle was far from over, but now at least they had hope. The battle was over, but the war had only just begun. The courthouse steps were now quiet, the shouts of protest fading into the background as the dust settled. The officers had been arrested, but the corruption they represented still loomed large. Marcus and Brock had faced the system, and for the first time in a long while it seemed as though they had won. But as they stood there, side by side, the magnitude of the fight ahead became clearer with each passing moment. Their victory wasn't an end, it was a beginning, a beacon for others to rise, speak out, and demand justice. Days after the protest, Marcus stood in front of a new shop he had opened with the help of his community. It was a small, unassuming storefront nestled on a corner, but for Marcus, it was everything. The new shop wasn't just a business, it was a symbol of resilience, of a dream he'd fought for, and of a community that had come together to lift him up. Inside, the shelves were lined with his handcrafted jewelry and art, each piece telling a story of his heritage, his struggle, and his triumph. Marcus had worked tirelessly to get to this point. The previous months had been a whirlwind of stress, fear, and exhaustion, but as he looked around the shop now, he couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of pride. He had been knocked down time and again, but he had always risen. As he stepped out into the street, he saw the familiar faces of his community. People stopped to greet him, to shake his hand, to congratulate him on the shop. It felt like a homecoming. But more than that, it was a reminder of everything he had fought for: his dignity, his livelihood, his right to exist on his own terms. His phone buzzed, and he looked down at the message. It was from Brock. "Good job today. Keep pushing. You're not alone." A smile tugged at Marcus's lips. Brock had become more than just a friend or a partner in the fight. He had become a symbol of the kind of allyship that was rare in this world, a reminder that even the most unlikely people could step up when it mattered. Marcus knew that what had happened was just a small victory in a much larger fight. The legal battles were ongoing, and the officers who had been arrested weren't the only ones involved in the corruption. But for now, he allowed himself to savor the moment, the feeling of standing firm, of knowing he had made a difference. Brock had always been a fighter, but it had taken him years to understand what that truly meant. He had walked away from the WWE ring, at the height of his career, uncertain of what his future held. For a long time, he had lived in the shadow of his past, his reputation, his fame, his physical dominance. But after seeing Marcus's struggle, after standing beside him in that courtroom, and facing down the forces of corruption, Brock had realized something profound: his true fight wasn't in the ring. It was out here, in the world. It was a fight for justice, for equality, for the people who had been forgotten by the very system that was meant to protect them. In the weeks following the courthouse protest, Brock had become more involved in activism. He began using his platform, his voice, and his influence to speak out about systemic injustice. He worked alongside legal teams, community activists, and organizers to shed light on the broader issue of police brutality and racial discrimination. What had started as a momentary decision to stand with Marcus had evolved into a personal mission, a calling that Brock hadn't fully realized he needed. He started attending rallies, speaking at public forums, and using his social media presence to amplify the voices of those who had been silenced. He didn't just want to be remembered for his fights in the ring, he wanted to be remembered for fighting for something far greater. Brock's involvement became a beacon of hope for many. He wasn't just a former champion, he was an ally in the truest sense of the word, and for Marcus, that meant everything. He had seen Brock grow from the hulking, silent figure at the courthouse to a man willing to risk everything for what was right. When Brock and Marcus met up again, this time at Marcus's new shop, It was clear that their friendship had become something deeper. It was more than a partnership, it was a brotherhood forged in the fires of shared struggle. "I can't believe you're actually doing this," Marcus said, clapping Brock on the back as they stood outside the shop. "I'm proud of you, man. You're using your platform for something real." Brock smiled, but there was a seriousness in his eyes. "I've always been a fighter," he said, his voice low and thoughtful. "But it took me a long time to understand what I was really fighting for. I want to be a part of something that lasts, something that changes things for the better." Marcus nodded, looking around at the community gathered outside the shop. "This is just the start, Brock. We've got a long way to go." Brock nodded, his eyes scanning the crowd. "But we'll get there. Together." Though Marcus and Brock had won a significant victory, they knew the war was far from over. The officers who had been arrested were only the tip of the iceberg. As their investigation continued, new details about the corruption within the police department came to light. Other officers, city officials, and even business leaders were implicated in the network of exploitation and abuse. But this wasn't just about the two of them anymore. The protest they had started, the legal battles they had fought, had sparked something larger. It had ignited a fire in their community, a movement that was no longer willing to be silenced. More protests followed. More voices joined the cause. The press, which had initially been hesitant, now turned its cameras on the systemic issues Marcus and Brock had been fighting. News outlets began to report on the abuse of power, the mistreatment of black street vendors, and the collusion between local law enforcement and corrupt businesses. The story had taken on a life of its own, and the ripples of their actions were felt far beyond the courthouse steps. For Marcus, this new chapter was bittersweet. The road ahead would be hard. But he wasn't alone. He had allies now, and he had something he hadn't had before: hope. As he looked out over his shop, now bustling with business and filled with customers, he couldn't help but think back to the first time he'd set up his cart on the street corner, fighting just to survive. But now, as he stood tall, with Brock by his side and his community rallying behind him, Marcus knew one thing for sure: this was only the beginning. The camera lingered on Marcus and Brock as they stood together outside the shop, their faces framed by the fading light of the setting sun. The city around them had its flaws, its battles, and its broken systems. But in that moment, with the streets alive with possibility and the voices of the people echoing in their ears, there was a quiet sense of peace. Marcus had fought for his dignity. Brock had fought for justice. And together they had shown the world that no matter the odds, no one is ever truly alone in the fight for what's right. The camera pulled back, revealing the shop, the people, and the ever-growing crowd outside, a symbol of defiance, of strength, and of an unshakable will to stand up against oppression. The screen faded to black, leaving the audience with the lasting impression that the fight for justice wasn't just a moment, it was a movement, one that would continue long after the final bell had rung.